The word cancer arrived like a thunderclap in the middle of a quiet afternoon. Sudden, brutal, and impossible to ignore. For years, the world had known Halle Berry as the woman who could command a screen with a single glance, the actress whose strength seemed almost mythic. But in a sterile hospital room filled with the quiet hum of machines, that strength was being tested in a way no role had ever demanded. The diagnosis was not gentle. It was not uncertain. It was a threat to her life. Doctors spoke in careful tones, using words that tried to soften the gravity of the moment, but the meaning remained the same. The disease had progressed quietly, hidden beneath the rhythms of everyday life. By the time it revealed itself, it had already begun to fight for control of her body. Standing beside her hospital bed was Olivier Martinez. He had faced cameras, premieres, and the relentless attention of Hollywood with calm confidence before. But nothing in his life had prepared him for the sight in front of him now. The woman who had once radiated unstoppable energy now lay beneath pale hospital lights, her breathing measured, her body connected to machines that blinked like silent witnesses. For a long moment, Olivier said nothing. His hand remained wrapped around hers, as if letting go might somehow allow the illness to take more than it already had. Outside the hospital room, the corridor was strangely quiet. Nurses walked past in soft steps. A distant phone rang somewhere behind closed doors. Yet inside that room, time seemed to move differently. Slow, heavy, stretched by fear and uncertainty. Earlier that morning, a doctor had called Olivier aside. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it changed everything. The doctor's voice had been calm, almost too calm. "The cancer is aggressive," he said. Those 3 words echoed in Olivier's mind long after the conversation ended. Aggressive. A word that suddenly made every memory feel fragile. Every laugh they had shared. Every late-night conversation. Every moment that once felt ordinary. When Olivier returned to Halle's bedside, she looked at him quietly. She already understood. Actors are skilled at reading emotions, at noticing the smallest flicker in another person's face. Halle had spent decades doing exactly that on screen. Now she read the truth in Olivier's eyes before he could speak a single word. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence was not empty. It was full of unspoken questions. Outside the hospital windows, the city moved on as if nothing had changed. Cars passed through intersections. People hurried down sidewalks. Somewhere, a movie theater was probably showing one of Halle Berry's old films, the audience unaware that the woman on the screen was now fighting a battle far from the red carpet. Inside the room, however, every sound seemed amplified. The steady rhythm of a heart monitor, the slow rise and fall of Halle's breathing, and the quiet whisper of Olivier's voice as he leaned closer to her. "You're going to fight this," he said softly. But even as the words left his mouth, they carried the weight of desperation. It was not a command. It was a plea. Over the following hours, doctors entered and left the room repeatedly. Charts were reviewed. Test results were discussed in hushed voices. Each new piece of information seemed to deepen the gravity of the situation. The illness had advanced further than anyone had expected. Treatment options existed, but none were simple. Each path carried risks. Each decision felt like stepping into the unknown. Olivier remained beside Halle through every conversation. At one point, he stepped into the hallway and pressed his hands against the cool wall, trying to steady himself. The polished floor reflected the harsh white lights above, creating a strange, endless brightness that made the moment feel unreal. He thought about their life together. The first time they met, the laughter that once filled their home, the quiet evenings when fame disappeared, and they were simply 2 people sharing the same space. And now this. When Olivier returned to the room again, Halle was awake, staring toward the window. The late afternoon sun filtered through the glass, painting a faint gold across the blanket covering her. For a moment she looked almost peaceful, but the machines beside her told another story. Olivier sat down slowly, his hand again finding hers. "I'm here," he whispered. Halle turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. There was strength there, but also something else, a quiet awareness that life had suddenly shifted onto an uncertain path. Outside, the sun continued its slow descent behind the city skyline. Inside the hospital room, the lights remained bright. The machines continued their steady rhythm, and Olivier Martinez sat beside his wife, watching, waiting, refusing to move as the long night approached. The hospital room did not look dramatic in the way movies often portray tragedy. There were no storms outside the window, no frantic shouting in the corridors. Everything was strangely ordinary. And perhaps that was what made the moment feel even heavier. The light above Halle Berry's bed hummed softly. A plastic cup of water sat on the bedside table, the surface trembling slightly each time the air conditioning turned on. Next to it lay a folded hospital bracelet that had been replaced earlier that morning, its thin strip of plastic carrying her name, her date of birth, and a barcode that now seemed to represent a life reduced to medical data. Halle noticed small things. She always had. Even when she was younger, colleagues often said she had the strange ability to see details other people ignored. The way a room smelled after rain, the sound of footsteps in a hallway, the tiny hesitation in someone's voice when they were hiding something. Now, lying in that hospital bed, those instincts returned. She watched the clock on the wall. Each second felt louder than it should have been. Tick, tick, tick. Across the room, Olivier Martinez sat in a chair that looked too small for him. He had not moved much for hours. His jacket rested across the back of the chair, slightly wrinkled, as if it had been forgotten the moment he entered the room. His phone vibrated once on the table beside him. He didn't pick it up. Messages had been arriving all day. Friends, colleagues, people who had heard fragments of the news and wanted to know if it was true. But Olivier could not bring himself to respond. The world outside this room suddenly felt distant, like a place he no longer belonged. Instead, he focused on Halle. Every small movement she made, the way she adjusted the thin hospital blanket with slow fingers, the way her breathing changed when she tried to shift her position, the faint crease that appeared between her eyebrows whenever a wave of discomfort passed through her body. These were details no camera had ever captured. For decades, audiences had watched Halle Berry as powerful characters, women who fought villains, survived impossible situations, and walked through chaos with unwavering confidence. But the woman in this room was different. She was quieter, more fragile, and somehow more real. At one point, a nurse entered the room carrying a small tray of medications. Her shoes made almost no sound against the floor. "Good evening," the nurse said gently. Halle nodded. Olivier stood up automatically, as if his body had learned to react before his mind could catch up. The nurse checked the IV line connected to Halle's arm. The transparent tube carried a clear liquid that slowly disappeared into her bloodstream, drop by drop. It was strange how something so small could represent hope or fear. When the nurse finished, she placed a thermometer on the tray and paused for a moment, looking at Halle with a quiet kindness that didn't feel rehearsed. "You should try to rest," she said softly. Halle gave a small smile. Rest. The word sounded simple, but her mind refused to slow down. Memories kept appearing without warning. A film set under bright desert sunlight. The applause after an award ceremony. The sound of her children laughing in the kitchen early in the morning. Each memory arrived like a photograph pulled from an old album, vivid and painfully alive. Olivier returned to his chair, leaning forward slightly. His hands were clasped together now, his thumbs moving slowly against each other, a habit he had whenever he was anxious. "Do you remember," he said quietly, "the house in the south of France?" Halle turned her head. Her eyes softened. "The one near the cliffs," Olivier continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "You said the ocean sounded different there." Halle nodded again. I said it sounded calmer, she murmured. For a moment, the hospital room disappeared. In its place, there was the memory of waves crashing against rocks far below a small white house, the scent of salt in the air, the wind moving through open windows. Those were the moments people rarely saw, the quiet ones, the ordinary ones, and yet they were the ones Olivier held onto now, as if remembering them could somehow protect the woman lying in front of him. Outside the hospital, night was beginning to settle over the city. Lights appeared in the windows of distant buildings. Cars moved slowly through intersections. Life continued. Inside the room, however, everything remained suspended in a fragile stillness. Halle reached slightly toward the bedside table. Her fingers brushed against a small object lying there. A photograph. It had been brought earlier in the day by a family member, one of those candid pictures taken years ago during a vacation. In the photo, Halle was laughing at something outside the frame, her hair blown by the wind, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that cannot be staged. She studied the picture quietly. Olivier watched her. "That's your favorite one," he said softly. She didn't answer right away. Her thumb moved slowly across the surface of the photograph, tracing the outline of her younger self. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. The clock on the wall kept ticking, and somewhere beyond the hospital walls, the world kept moving forward, unaware that inside this quiet room, two people were holding on to the smallest details, memories, gestures, fragments of ordinary life, as if those tiny moments were the only way to make sense of everything that had suddenly changed. Night deepened slowly around the hospital. The corridor lights dimmed one by one, leaving long shadows stretching across the polished floor. The hospital had entered that strange hour when the world outside slept, but inside, everything remained quietly awake. In Halle Berry's room, the only constant sound was the soft rhythm of the heart monitor. Beep! Pause. Beep! Each sound carried an unsettling sense of precision, as if time itself had become mechanical. Olivier Martinez had not realized how long he had been sitting there until he looked at the clock again. 2:17 a.m. The numbers glowed faintly red in the darkness. He stood up slowly and walked toward the window, careful not to wake her. Outside, the city lights shimmered in the distance, scattered like fragments of glass across the skyline. Somewhere far below, a car passed along the empty street, its headlights briefly reflecting against the hospital walls. Everything looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Behind him, Halle shifted slightly. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but Olivier turned immediately. He returned to the bedside and leaned closer. Her eyes were open, not wide with fear, not clouded by confusion, just quietly awake. For a moment, she stared at the ceiling as if listening to something invisible. Then she spoke. "Did the doctor come back?" Her voice was softer than before. Olivier hesitated. It was a brief hesitation, barely noticeable. But in that silence lived 1,000 unanswered questions. "The doctors are still reviewing the scans," he said carefully. It was the truth. But it was not the whole truth. Earlier that evening, two specialists had entered the room carrying a folder thick with test results. They had spoken quietly in the hallway for several minutes before asking Olivier to step outside. The conversation that followed remained unfinished. One of the doctors had pointed to an image on the scan, a shadow, something irregular, something that didn't behave the way they expected. But they hadn't explained everything yet. "Some things don't match," one doctor had said. It was a strange phrase. Some things don't match. Olivier had replayed those words again and again in his mind. Back in the room, Halle slowly turned her head toward him. "You're not telling me everything." Her voice carried no accusation, only observation. Actors spend their lives studying expressions, pauses, tone. And even now, despite exhaustion and illness, Halle Berry could still read a moment better than most people. Olivier sat down again. For several seconds, he looked at their hands resting side by side on the blanket. "I just don't want to say something before the doctors are certain," he replied quietly. Halle watched him. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Not a large smile, just a small curve of the lips, almost like someone remembering a private joke. "You always hated uncertainty," she said. He exhaled softly. "That hasn't changed." Another silence followed. But this silence was different. It wasn't filled with fear. It was filled with waiting. Across the room, the IV pump clicked softly as another measured drop of medication entered Halle's bloodstream. The liquid moved slowly through the transparent tube, almost hypnotic in its quiet persistence. Outside the door, a pair of nurses passed by, speaking in low voices. Fragments of their conversation drifted into the room. "Lab results. Another scan in the morning." Not typical. The voices faded quickly down the hallway. Halle's eyes shifted toward the door. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Olivier nodded. But neither of them commented further, because the truth was becoming stranger with each passing hour. Earlier that night, the doctors had expected the test results to confirm their original diagnosis clearly. Instead, the images raised more questions. The tumor behaved oddly. Some markers suggested something aggressive. Other markers suggested something different. Something they had not anticipated. Back in the hallway, Olivier remembered one of the younger doctors speaking quietly to another. "I've never seen results like this," she had said. Now, sitting beside Halle again, he wondered whether that uncertainty was a good sign, or something far more complicated. Halle closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, she looked toward the photograph still resting on the bedside table. The same picture from earlier. The wind in her hair, the sunlight on her face. A moment from another life. "You know what's strange?" she said suddenly. Olivier leaned closer. "What?" She studied the photograph carefully. "I don't feel the way they described." The statement hung quietly in the air. "Pain?" Olivier asked. "No." She shook her head slightly. "I mean, the illness." She paused, searching for the right words. "They keep describing something very serious, something that should make me feel weaker." Her gaze returned to him. "But I don't feel weaker." That observation had crossed Olivier's mind as well. Despite the diagnosis, despite the frightening scans, Halle had moments of unusual clarity and energy, moments that didn't quite align with the doctor's expectations. The thought unsettled him, because it meant one of two things. Either the illness was behaving unpredictably, or the doctors were still missing something. Outside the window, a faint line of pale blue had begun to appear along the horizon. Morning was approaching. The hospital slowly stirred back to life. In the hallway, footsteps multiplied. Carts rolled past. Phones began to ring again. But inside the room, the quiet tension remained. Halle continued looking at the photograph. Olivier continued watching her. And somewhere within the hospital, doctors were studying scans, exchanging uncertain glances, and asking questions that still had no answers. Morning arrived without ceremony. There was no dramatic sunrise, no sudden burst of hopeful music, the way films sometimes pretend life works. Instead, light slowly filtered through the hospital blinds, thin and pale, spreading across the floor like a quiet visitor that had no intention of announcing itself. Inside the room, the night had left traces behind. An empty coffee cup sat near the window, where Olivier Martinez had stood hours earlier. The chair beside the bed was slightly turned, as if someone had shifted restlessly during the long stretch of darkness. On the bedside table, the photograph remained exactly where it had been, its edges catching the first hint of daylight. Halle Berry was awake again, not fully sitting up, just watching the slow movement of light along the ceiling. For a moment, she said nothing, as though the room itself deserved a moment of quiet after everything that had been spoken during the night. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. Beep, pause. Beep! Olivier had fallen asleep in the chair sometime before dawn. His head leaned slightly forward, one arm resting on the edge of the bed, as if he had refused, even in sleep, to move too far away. Halle studied him carefully. There was something strangely tender about the way exhaustion had softened his face. The man who had spent the entire night bracing himself against fear now looked younger, almost boyish, as if sleep had briefly carried him somewhere far from hospital corridors and medical charts. She didn't wake him immediately. Instead, her attention drifted to the hallway beyond the door. Footsteps moved past every few minutes, nurses beginning their shifts, doctors speaking in low voices. The quiet choreography of a hospital morning. Somewhere down the corridor, a cart rattled softly over the floor tiles. The metallic sound echoed faintly, then disappeared again. Halle reached slowly toward the bedside table. Her fingers touched the photograph. For a long moment she simply held it there, turning it slightly so the morning light illuminated the image more clearly. The version of herself in the picture looked almost like another person. Wind in her hair, eyes bright, laughing at something the camera had not captured. A memory frozen at a moment when illness did not exist. Behind her, Olivier stirred slightly. He opened his eyes slowly, as though remembering where he was took several seconds. When he finally looked up and saw Halle awake, he straightened in the chair. "You didn't sleep," he said quietly. Halle gave a small shrug. "I watched the sunrise." Olivier glanced toward the window. The sky outside had turned a pale silver blue now, the city slowly returning to life. Traffic had begun again in the distance, faint and steady. For a moment, neither of them mentioned the doctors, or the scans, or the shadow that had appeared in the medical images. Those things seemed to exist somewhere outside the room, temporarily suspended in the quiet space between night and morning. A nurse entered briefly to check the IV. Her movements were gentle, practiced. She adjusted the drip, glanced at the monitor, wrote something down on a small chart, and then offered Halle a quick smile before leaving again. The door closed softly behind her. Olivier leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "They said the specialists will come back soon," he murmured. Halle nodded, but she didn't ask what they might say. Instead, she looked again toward the window. Sunlight was stronger now. It spilled across the floor, climbing slowly toward the bed, as if measuring the room inch by inch. "You know what I was thinking about earlier?" she said after a while. Olivier lifted his head. "What?" "The ocean." He blinked. "The house near the cliffs?" She nodded. "I remember standing on the balcony one morning," she continued quietly. "Everything looked so calm. The water, the sky, even the wind felt slow." Her voice trailed off slightly. "And yet the waves kept moving." Olivier listened without interrupting. "Not loudly," she added. "Not violently." She paused. "Just constantly." Outside the hospital, the city was fully awake now. Cars moved through intersections. People hurried across sidewalks. Morning sunlight reflected off windows far beyond the hospital walls. Inside the room, the heart monitor continued its careful rhythm. Beep! Pause. Beep! Olivier looked toward the door for a moment, as though expecting the doctors to appear at any second. But the hallway remained quiet. Somewhere deeper in the building, phones rang again. A distant voice called out a patient's name. The ordinary sounds of another day beginning. Halle placed the photograph back on the table. Her hand lingered there for a moment. Then she turned her attention toward the window once more. The sunlight had finally reached the edge of the bed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the light moved across the blanket. And in that quiet hospital room, between the unanswered questions and the approaching footsteps of doctors not yet seen, the morning continued unfolding. Patiently, silently. While the story remained suspended somewhere between what had already been said and everything that had not.